This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. We speak from our personal experiences and opinions. The views expressed are solely those of the individual speaker and are not intended to malign any group, club, organization, or business.
Welcome to Confronting the Line, where we discuss the world of personal development and the sometimes dicey line between transformation and exploitation. My name is Mark Tafoya, and I'm here with our host, Ann Peterson. Hi, Ann.
Thanks, Mark.
How you doing today?
I'm awesome.
Okay, well, we are both very excited today to introduce our guest, Dr. John Hunter. Dr. John is from South Africa, and he's a researcher and lecturer, and he's done a lot of research into the world of large group awareness trainings, or LGATs, as they're known. So we're really excited to have you here with us, Dr. John. Welcome.
Hi, how you guys doing?
Yeah, or should I say, how's it?
How's it? That's actually 100%. Yeah.
That's how you do it in South Africa, right? Yeah. So welcome. We're really excited to have you here today. We want to start really by just having you share a little bit about your background, and we'd really love to hear kind of like what got you into the world that you're in, the particular area of research. But you can start with your credentials.
Sure. So I have a PhD in psychology. I completed it at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, which is in Durban on the east coast of South Africa. I actually got into psychology quite late. So I studied business science at the University of Cape Town, finance, and I worked in that space, consulting, management, accounting, those sorts of things for about 10 years. And actually, quite soon after I completed my degree in finance, I experienced what's called a manic episode, which relates to bipolar disorder. And I think we might talk about this a little bit. And I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And that kind of really initiated my interest in psychology, my interest in the way that, your mind works, and also just a real interest in how somebody, and I think of myself as being quite a rational, logical person, how somebody like myself could think so illogically about certain things and have thoughts that were so distorted. And that was really something that I found quite interesting. While it was frightening and problematic and all those sorts of things, I did find it very interesting. So that was actually in 2003. From 2003 to 2010, I started learning about bipolar disorder. I wanted to manage it as well as I could. I'm not sure what you know about it, but it's got a very high rate of suicide. Yeah, it can be really destructive. So in the sort of elevated states, which are called mania and hypermania, really high levels of energy, excitement, motivation, confidence, euphoria, but also often quite reckless behaviors. So doing things that you might not otherwise do. And so that can be really problematic. And then on the sort of really extreme side of mania, you start seeing psychosis. So things like delusions, sometimes hallucinations, that kind of thing. And then you've got the lower side of it, which is depression. And the suicide attempt rate in bipolar disorder is actually about double that of unipolar depression, according to one study. So normal depression, you think of as maybe the worst thing a person can go through. With bipolar disorder, it tends to be a bit worse. And there are a number of reasons for that. Some of it's got to do with the fact that often when people are hypermanic or manic, they really wreck their lives. So they spend a lot of money, or they get divorced, or they do things that cause them a lot of problems, and then they sink into this low mood, and then they've actually got something really difficult that they need to deal with, and they're looking at it through this really negative lens. So from 2003 to 2010, I was just trying to understand the disorder, trying to work out ways to avoid having further relapses, having further episodes, because they can cause so many problems. And then in 2010, I was working I started a new job, and at the company, they kind of said to us, well, as part of the induction, you're going to need to take part in these 2 personal development seminars. And that's how they marketed them to us. And I said to them, well, okay, great.
Yeah.
I mean, I tried to find out a little bit about it, but I also wasn't particularly concerned. I didn't expect
Sure.
what we ended up going through. And we had a meeting with the chairman, and the chairman said this to us. And I subsequently realized that this is often the way that large group awareness trainings are marketed. He said, there are things that you know, there are things that you don't know, but then there are things that you don't know that you don't know. And these trainings are basically about those things. And so it was quite, ambiguous, and it seemed quite magical and amazing. And there was a lot of talk about how it would change your life and it was going to be incredible, but no specifics about what was going to happen were given. So
you just sent Mark and I into an incident of desire to draw a circle on the board. So for all the introductions we used to
or
lead,
aversion.
Yeah, or an aversion. Anyway, sorry, I just had to kind of make the joke because it was so lying there. But yeah, we would draw the big, we would draw a circle, and this is everything that is possible to know. And this, it's amazing to me how much it's just right there, Mark. Do you have that same? It was like, oh, and this is this little slice of what you know, and this is a slice of what you don't know. And then the
Even
rest
when
of it is
says,
what
they begin the sentence as "there's what you know." I go here. I know what the rest is coming. I know everything else in that sentence, man. Yeah.
So our deconstructing selves, Dr. John, just kind of went
really kind of grandiose way, like as if there was this thing that we were going to find out that was going to be so amazing. And I mean, the chairman said to us things like, "I guarantee that on the last day, you're going to." He used the word "you'll pop," and he said you'll have the greatest day of your life. Like, I guarantee it. And having experienced mania and hypermania before, those are really the opposites of depression. And I mean, you really just feel like you can take on the world when you're in these states. And so I kind of thought to myself, well, that's a really big promise. If it is greater than hypermania or mania, then I'll be very impressed. So it wasn't a huge group of us that did this seminar. There were 24 of us in total. Not all of the people were from our organization, but there were 24 of us, and it was in a school hall, and it started at 6:00 in the evening on a Thursday evening, and it went until 2 in the morning, and then there was homework on top of it. And then Friday we worked a normal day. It started at 6 in the evening, and then it went until 2 in the morning with homework. Saturday started at 9, ended at 12 with homework. And then there was Sunday, and it started a bit later on Sunday, and it went from about 10 till about 7 in the evening, I would say. And I mean, I remember the exact weekend that it was because it was the World Cup soccer in South Africa. This was in 2010. And I remember before the seminar, I'm not a huge soccer supporter, but there were people at our company who kind of said, we may miss the World Cup final. And the chairman kind of said, well, this is more important. You'll understand once you've done it. And so the level of importance that was placed on this seemed to be quite extreme. So that was something that I kind of noticed. But again, before I did it, I didn't really have any big concerns. I didn't expect what would happen. And having subsequently learned about other large group awareness trainings, I realized that there's a spectrum of how abusive they can be. And, that word may not necessarily apply to all LGATs. Ours was incredibly abusive. So the seminar leader would scream at people. He would swear at them, stand in their faces, scream at them. But there were a lot of exercises that involved things like sharing, and people would share about quite personal things. And he would often say to them, he'd work with them, but essentially say to them, you are responsible for whatever it is that you've been through. There were a number of exercises. There were diet positions where people would sit with their knees touching each other. There were songs that we would have to listen to. There were guided visualization exercises where you'd have to visualize maybe things from your childhood, or visualize painful things that you may have experienced, or something quite frightening. And then typically after the relatively stressful exercises, there would be something that would be quite relaxing. So you would do something that was quite stressful, and then you would kind of calm down. And this took place systematically over 3 days. And while I was sitting there, as I said, I'd studied bipolar disorder, and I knew that 3 key triggers for these elevated states of bipolar disorder were psychological stress, sleep disruption, and goal attainment. And so while I was sitting there, I was kind of going, okay, this couldn't be more of a psychologically stressful environment. There were a lot of rules that we had to agree to, so we couldn't talk to anyone next to each other. We could use the bathroom in the breaks that were provided. We couldn't use drugs or alcohol over the period, but there were a number of very specific things that we had to agree to. We had to agree to stay for the duration of the seminar. But I found it to be a highly controlled environment. I found it to be a highly stressful environment. And then there was also sleep disruption. So late evenings, homework, and then also being highly stimulated at the end of every evening. So it was quite difficult to go home and then just fall asleep immediately. So what tended to happen is that people weren't sleeping very much. And so I was kind of thinking, this is not great for me. I didn't know what to do about it. So I kind of was like, well, I know what the response to a bipolar disorder diagnosis is. It's highly stigmatized. The people that I was working with didn't know about it. I didn't want to reveal it to anyone because I thought it would limit my ability to kind of progress through the organization. So I thought, well, let me just get through this. I'm sure that I can manage for a couple of days, and I'll make any big decisions about it afterwards. After 3 days of what I would say was very high stress, on the final day, the atmosphere shifted very clearly from being quite oppressive. The trainer, who was what I would describe as abusive for 3 days, suddenly was very loving. And, he wanted everyone to sign up for the advanced training, which was apparently really going to blow your mind. You haven't seen anything yet. And so he was kind and loving, and everyone graduated, and there was hugging and dancing and that sort of thing, and essentially a graduation. And so again, I'm sitting there and I'm going, okay, there's been psychological stress, there's been sleep disruption, and now there's goal attainment. You've reached the end, you've achieved this goal, the stress is removed. And I was like, okay, well, you've got these 3 key ingredients for a hypomanic or manic episode. Then I started seeing the way that people were behaving. So we'd been told that we were going to pop on the final day. We'd been told that we're going to have this transformation as a result of this seminar. And so I was like, okay, great. Then I started seeing how people were behaving. I started thinking about what we were actually told in terms of how people would behave. So what I started seeing were things like people were euphoric. And when I say euphoric, they were smiling, they were dancing, they were radiant, they looked happier than you can ever imagine. There were people at the Tuesday night's graduation, because we finished on a Sunday and then there was a break. And then on the Tuesday, you had the official graduation. You were asked to bring family and friends and that sort of thing. And people were, there were these 2 women that I spoke to, and they kind of said, my face is sore. I've been smiling so much for the last couple of days that my face is sore. Like, that's how elevated they were. And it was everywhere. It wasn't 1 or 2 people. It was pretty much everyone that had participated. They were euphoric. They seemed to be incredibly confident. They seemed to be very energized. So a lot of people said things like, even though we got hardly any sleep, I haven't slept much the last couple of days, and I'm still feeling, I'm fine. I'm not feeling like I need caffeine. I just feel like I can sort of keep going. People were highly motivated. So a lot of people coming back with very big ideas about what they were going to do, changes that they were going to make. So whether it was, a new business thing that they were going to do, or I'm going to start training to do X, Y, and Z, or whatever. But there was a lot of sense of, I can accomplish something that previously they couldn't. And obviously that's wonderful. That's great. And so there was a lot of positivity as a result of participating. Something that I'd heard, people couldn't tell me what was going to happen in the seminar. They'd explicitly been told, you cannot talk about the details of what takes place. But a lot of them said, what I can tell you is that strangely, there've been quite a lot of divorces. Like a lot of people have been divorced soon after participating. And so I kind of thought, well, that's a little bit odd. And it wasn't a huge company. So the fact that that had happened, several times was interesting to me. Only after participating and after seeing the way that people were behaving, thinking about the promise of the greatest day of our lives, and then thinking about people getting divorced, which is quite an impulsive thing to do. It's a big decision to make. I started drawing very clear links between what I was seeing and the symptoms of hypomania and mania, which are the elevated states of bipolar disorder. And so what are those symptoms? You see euphoria, elevated confidence, energy, motivation, often a sense of creativity. You often have decisiveness, so people making decisions that can be good, but impulsivity is the extreme of that. People may say things that they wouldn't otherwise say. And so a lot of people were expressing, love to people that they maybe hadn't done before. And again, that's a great thing. But other people maybe would say something in a meeting and you would sort of think to yourself, that's maybe something that you shouldn't have shared in this particular context. So people were just very open with their thoughts. And again,
one of the things I've been accused of is that. Sorry, there was a delay there. Well, I just thought that point about doing things that you wouldn't normally do or whatnot, that's really interesting, because one of the things I struggled with in my sort of post-landmark career was learning how to not share everything, all the intimate sharing everything about my life. Because as a program leader, that was your cred, that was your credibility, that was your capital, that's how you opened up the space, so to speak. That's how the breakthroughs come, and so anyway, that was interesting that you said that. And I've worked with a number of people who kind of post their career, post their time, significant or deep time inside of Landmark was the organization I knew of, but others as well. That's this place they struggled with, sort of like, not just that they talk funny, like use language funny, but the sort of oversharing, the too much, like kind of just being too much almost in the space in a lot of ways. So that was interesting. Anyway, that caught my attention as you said that.
And again, I don't think that it's always a bad thing. I think that vulnerability is wonderful, and it can be an incredible bonding thing. But maybe to give a couple of more specific examples, because after that, I started trying to understand. I sort of thought there seems to be some sort of relationship between what's going on in this seminar that I took part in and bipolar disorder. So that was my sort of interest. So in 2010, so then I started doing reading, and I, started typing words into Google, and eventually found my way to discussion forums where, thousands of people were sharing their experiences of going through, and it wasn't called whatever my one was called. And mine wasn't called LifeSpring. It wasn't called EST. It wasn't called Landmark. It was called something completely different. But people from, Bulgaria and Australia and, Canada and parts of South America and Africa and whatever, they were all sharing almost identical things about some seminar that they'd been through that also wasn't necessarily called LifeSpring or EST or whatever. And I realized that these seminars exist all over the place, and they were talking about the same things, often talking about going through a couple of days that was quite psychologically stressful, depending on where the seminar was, often quite traumatic, often a heavy focus on accepting personal responsibility for things, often quite a dominating trainer, often a set of rules that you have to agree to, often very long days, control of the environment, often homework exercises, often pressure to recruit, family and friends playing a big role in it, and even very frequently, identical exercises. And I don't mean similar exercises, I mean identical exercises. And maybe to give you a couple of examples, after I got out of
That's
the
what I was just
seminar,
going to
because
say. Do you have an example?
sure. So after I got out of the seminar, because from having bipolar disorder, I try to be analytical about things. I don't want my thinking to be distorted by how I'm feeling, because that can often lead to problems. You know, when you elevated, you think everything's great, you think you're great. When you're depressed, your mood dictates your view of yourself and the world. So I try to be as evidence-based as I can. So I got out of the seminar, and it seemed like I was the only person who found that there was a problem with it. And that was odd to me, because objectively, the trainer was highly abusive. But everyone came out and thought it was the greatest thing ever. And I was kind of like, well, I'm doubting myself. Let me just write down what happened, and then try to make sense of it, you know, in a non-pressurized environment. So I wrote down, and everything I could remember, it was a 30-page typed document of just this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And I just kind of ran through it. And one of the things that I wrote down was a song that we were made to sing. So at one point, the men and the women were broken into two different groups, and the women were asked to put on essentially like a rubbish bag, and then they had to come and do kind of a skit in front of everyone, acting as sort of cavemen, and the men had to dress up as little girls, and we had to come out and sing this song. And I remember the lyrics to the song were 10 little fingers, 10 little toes, long curly hair, and a cute little nose, something something something, and a cute little figure. Look out, guys, when I get bigger. And I mean, I'd written this down. And then I was reading, maybe a year or two later, while I was trying to understand as much as I could about these things, I was reading a book called The Book of Est, written by Luke Reinhardt, initially in 1976. Literally the very same song with the exact words is written,
Wow.
What is it, 40 years earlier in the US somewhere. I'm in Durban, South Africa. I'm doing something that, apparently has got nothing to do with these other organizations. And you've got something like that that's, very similar. There was something in Est called the danger process, where participants would kind of line up, and then the trainer and some of the assistants would essentially confront them. And, the descriptions say that people were often so overwhelmed by it that they would collapse and, faint and that kind of thing. They had the same thing in our seminar. There were also a number of things directly from LifeSpring, which was the other very prominent LGAT from the 1970s and 1980s. So there was something called the red and black game, which was used in LifeSpring. There was something called the lifeboat game, which was used in LifeSpring. There was something called dyad exercises, so these are very specific things. There was a term that they used, and I realized that there's a lot of jargon that's used in Landmark, in Est, and all these organizations. In LifeSpring, they had a word called grungies, which I think that the Landmark equivalent is racket. But, in LifeSpring, they had this word called grungy. They had this word called grungy in our seminar. I've just done some work in the troubled teen industry in the United States, and I was looking at a workshop that these young women were made to go through. It was heavily based on LifeSpring. They used the word grungy in that. They used the red and black game. They used the lifeboat exercise. So
wow,
it's often.
Can you say what grungy is? Do you know enough of what a grungy is? Now I'm super curious. Is it a racket? I mean, I'm curious.
So from what I remember, and I mean, this is 14 years ago now, it's a complaint which allows you to avoid dealing with something. So I can't remember exactly how it was described.
Sounds familiar.
I don't know if that's quite similar to the way that racket is used, but
a persistent complaint with a fixed way of being that has costs and payoffs.
Yes, so there was that conversation about what is the payoff that you're getting for this grungy. Let's have a look at that, and maybe you can, over the next couple of days, you can get rid of some of these things. So
Yeah.
I think the short summary of what I'm saying is that I started looking into these seminars. I found that there's a lot of similarity between them, and if not in the explicit specific exercises, very much in the structure and in the tone, that kind of shift of a couple of days of quite high stress, um, confrontation, really looking at yourself, a lot of crying and opening up and that sort of thing. And then that switch at the end to love and affirmation, and you've graduated and whatever. And these elevated affective states, these elevated moods where people just feel like they can take over the world.
And John, may I ask, you mentioned in your experience on that third day where you saw people popping, or having that euphoric kind of feeling. Did you find yourself having that feeling, or were you kind of like noticing it, and because of your own history, were you saying, I got to be careful? Like, what was that like for you?
So I mean, that's a great question. I could feel that my mood had been elevated. But in bipolar disorder, there's something called a mixed state, which is when you're kind of experiencing elevated symptoms and depressive symptoms at the same time. And I felt like I was more in that state. So I was very energized, but I wasn't feeling euphoric. I don't know if that makes sense. So I was feeling
Yeah.
highly, highly
Yeah.
energized. So I felt like I was kind of manic, but I was also, because of the cognitive side, because I was kind of looking at this and trying to make sense of it and whatever, I wasn't just running with it. And that's something that I'd really sort of trained myself to do. So I've got to be very suspicious when I start feeling good, which is quite a weird thing. But if I start feeling incredibly good and optimistic and confident, I know the degree to which it can go in me. And so for me, that's something that I kind of am scared of, rather than
Yeah, it sounds like wary, like it has you be wary of something.
yeah. And I'd learned a couple of things. I mean, so for example, I chatted to Brian and Eric about it, because Brian specifically mentioned it, and then Eric actually said, well, the same thing happened with him. But Brian mentioned that after he did the forum, he was just blasting music and he was singing at the top of his lungs, and he was just, feeling incredible. And Eric had a similar explanation of just listening to music. And whenever I start listening to music and I'm in my car and it's sounding too good, and I'm like, oh, this is the greatest thing in the world, for me, that's a good indicator that my mood is starting to elevate. And it's an objective thing that I can look at and kind of go, okay, maybe I need to just calm myself down, maybe not indulge in stimulation too much, because for me at least, it can lead to some quite problematic behavior and thoughts and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I bet.
Really
And then,
appreciate.
so
Go ahead.
at this point in your life, though, I want to kind of underline, you hadn't done any formal study. You weren't doing the PhD yet, or had you?
No, I wasn't. So that was in 2010 that I went
This
through
is all
the
your
LGAT.
personal, like how to manage your own illness at that point.
Exactly. So it was very much a
Okay.
practical thing. And so I kind of was making these connections, and I thought, okay, well, let me just go and speak to some psychologists about this, some professors. I'm sure they'll be interested in this, because to me, it was strange that you could put people through what I thought was objectively an unpleasant 3 days with a person who I thought was objectively quite abusive. And then they would love this person at the end and think that and feel like they've had the greatest time of their lives. There was something very counterintuitive about that. So I approached professors at the university I ended up going to, and I tried to explain it to them, but they didn't really believe me, to be honest. I mean, if you think about what happens in, I don't know, a large group awareness training, it's a strange environment. I think that's a mild way of explaining it. It's a very odd environment to be in. So if you're trying to explain this to somebody who's never heard of it before, they're going to be skeptical of it. And in order for me to explain what I thought was going on, I had to explain that it came from a practical experience of bipolar disorder. And that's not a very good way to get people to think that you're making sense. So if you say, the reason that I think this is going on is because of my bipolar disorder, the response is typically going to be, okay, well, this person's a bit crazy. Let's just not listen to what he has to say. So for 3 years after that, I carried on studying it, and I studied it a lot. So I was really trying to understand it as well as I could. And then 2013, I decided that I wanted to go back and study psychology. I wasn't enjoying being in the business world. It didn't connect with me very well, and I was fascinated by mental illness, and I was very interested in large group awareness training. So I went back. I studied the equivalent of an undergrad in 2013, honors in 2014, masters in 2015, and then I did my PhD 2016 and 2017. So it was a very fast turnaround. Most people take 3 or 4 years to do the PhD. And I think because I had done so much research over that 3-year period before I even started studying, that accelerated the process for me. And my focus was on the relationship between bipolar disorder and large group awareness training. And I mean, I've read comments underneath some of your videos, and I understand why there's going to be skepticism about why you are speaking out about these organizations, or about why you are saying whatever you're saying.
Yeah.
In my case, the reason that I studied it wasn't to develop an academic career. It's a terrible subject to try to study if you want to be able to publish papers and you want to go to conferences and you want to become a professor,
right,
and that sort of thing. It's incredibly difficult to publish on it. If you look for journal articles on large group awareness trainings, there's nothing that's really been written since the early 1990s. And there was a fear in me as well. I was aware that some of these organizations are quite litigious. I was worried about writing about them. I experienced a lot of anxiety, so it was a frightening thing for me to do. So my motivation wasn't,
I bet,
this is something that's going to give me an incredible career. It was really,
right.
I want to understand bipolar disorder better. It seems like these seminars might be helping to show something interesting about them. Let me explore it, and that's where the research came from.
And it's so fascinating because I imagine that it's like so rare that someone with a particular disorder says, I'm going to go get a PhD and learn about this disorder. I mean, I just think it's kind of, it's really fascinating that you would do that. And it must be unusual in the field, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think often people will study something because it's affected somebody in their lives. So somebody might study a particular disorder because it's impacted them in some way. I don't know how many people with bipolar disorder have gone and studied it. It can be challenging. So a lot of people with bipolar disorder struggle with cognition. There can be other difficulties that come with it. It can at times bring sort of hyper focus, and for me, a lot of the time that seems to be the case. So it allows me to really just put a lot of energy and focus onto something. But I mean, in line with what a lot of large group awareness trainings advocate, I think that was demonstrating taking responsibility. If that's not taking responsibility, I don't know what is. It's kind of like, I can either let this disorder wreck my life, and not only my life, but the people around me. So I've got a great support structure. I've got incredible family and friends. And if I'm not managing myself properly, then I'm affecting their lives. At the end of the day, they've got to pick up the pieces. They've got to, deal with me when I'm suicidal, when I've done something crazy, or I've spent all my money, or whatever it happens to be. So for me, it's about, this is the responsible thing to do. And it's fascinating to me. And that really is what drove my interest in the topic. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's quite inspiring, this idea of like, wow, I've got this thing. I could either, suffer silently, or I could go become an expert in it.
Well, I appreciate what you said too about it's hard to evaluate, analyze, criticize something that feels good. Like that's one of the things that I've noticed. Like I would say, when I originally wrote my book, it really was a love letter to the graduates. It was really kind of a warning because I had gotten so far to the inside and I saw how an organization that I had been told was completely separated from its founder wasn't really, and had just begun to kind of see that some of the, his personality and his issues had persisted in the organization. I would say, like, when I published the book, like, that's as far as my understanding was. And I was dealing with what happened in my euphoria, which was that my daughter was put in compromising situations repeatedly and, abused, assaulted and abused and neglected. And I didn't know any of that at the time. I thought she was in safe environments. She was, even in the place where she got sexually assaulted, she was with one of my trusted landmark community. And so I had lived in a kind of, it was challenging, it was difficult, but there is a kind of low grade euphoria, I would say, also when that's what you're doing 100% all the time, because mostly brought on by the fact that you're saving the world. This kind of idea that you're saving the world. And, I was going to have to be a working mom anyway. So why not work someplace where I'm also saving the world? And all that's fine. I don't have judgment on myself about that, mostly because I have a lot of teachers and therapists and stuff that I work with. But my daughter, in her early 20s started to display, mental health symptoms and physical. It started physical and mental health. And we now know she's been diagnosed with complex PTSD and a variety high anxiety and so on. And, every day in her life, my decisions that I made are alive for her in a different way than they are for me. And, so I really, that's what led me to start going, wait a minute, maybe everything about this wasn't so good. Like it wasn't so, plus I kind of started to notice that the world is like gone to shit. So I don't think I was doing a very good job saving the world, by the way. That was the other, but those things. And then you start to evaluate and look, and it's hard to look at ourselves in that way. It's hard to look at something we really believed in, and we made decisions and we made choices, and, and then to start to question it publicly it's been challenging, and I suspect it'll get more challenging for me, likely. But I feel like it's important because if we don't understand these things, how can we help each other? How can we protect ourselves? How can we, including the mental illnesses, like through my daughter's mental illness, starting to really understand, like, whoa, what is complex PTSD and what is trauma and how does it really present? I can now see my mother died in 2020, and I could see the end of her life. She was basically suffering from unresolved, unmitigated, untreated trauma that she had early in her life. She had done lots of programs, including she didn't do the forum, but she did context programs. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. She was deeply involved in context. Yeah.
So
And
context was actually formed by somebody that was initially one of the founders of LifeSpring, I believe. So
gotcha.
So the
which and all that kind of branched out of Mind Dynamics, right? I mean, it was like Henley and Werner; those guys were kind of Mind Dynamics, and
that's kind of an important thing I think to know is the question sometimes asked, well, what is a large group awareness training? What is an LGAT? And you can kind of speak about it in terms of the setup, so the actual exercises and structure of the seminar, the fact that it's generating this. They're often described as experiential because it's not necessarily about learning something. So there's different ways that you can view it. You can view it based on the sales model that they typically use, which is often word of mouth, proselytizing type of model. But the other thing that you can look at is the history. And if you go back to Mind Dynamics, which was an organization founded by Alexander Everett in 1967, a lot of the trainers at Mind Dynamics started, the first large group awareness training organizations, what I would consider to be the first organization. So EST was formed by Werner Erhard in 71. Psi World or Psi Seminars was founded by Thomas Wilhite, I think in 1973. LifeSpring was founded by John Hanley, as well as Charlene Aframo, who then went and worked for EST and then left EST. And
she was Werner's Mind Dynamics trainer.
Exactly. Then went back to LifeSpring again, and then ended up at Landmark afterwards. There was Stuart Emery, who was the first CEO of EST, and then he formed an organization called Actualizations. And then Robert White and Randy Revel and a couple of the other people that had formed LifeSpring with John Hanley ended up forming Context International and a number of organizations. But I mean, all of those people had been trainers at Mind Dynamics at one point, and most of them had been exposed to something called leadership dynamics as well. And so the history is shared between a lot of these founders. And given how similar they are, I mean, if you read John Hanley's book, he seems to be a lot more open about how similar the organizations are to each other. He wasn't as successful as Erhard was, and he seems to look up to Erhard in a lot of ways. But certainly a lot of similarities between them. And if you look at the organizations that are around today, there's really Landmark, which is a descendant of EST. And because Landmark tends to be quite, let's just say, cautious about other people using its methods, there aren't lots of little spin-off organizations that are using Landmark's methods. It seems to be Landmark and then people that have bought the license and are doing it on a very small scale. If you look at LifeSpring, because they don't exist anymore, there's nobody to challenge people if they just recreate these seminars. And because they're highly scripted and structured, people can just kind of do it a couple of times or be an employee or whatever, and then they just go and they start their own organization, some of them more professionally than others. I think if you had to see the way that the seminar that I did was run, you might be horrified and you might say, this doesn't really resemble what goes on in the Landmark Forum, for example. However, having done a PhD which focused on EST and the Forum and LifeSpring and Landmark and reviewed over 100 different people describing their experiences in the seminars and afterwards, because I wanted to draw a picture of what typically takes place in these things and then what is the response afterwards. There certainly are a lot of concerning interactions that I've seen in Landmark and EST. And again, people might say, well, that might have been 30 years ago. And I'm like, no, I stopped looking at about 2016. No. And there were still interactions that I thought, wow, that would be looked at, I think, by anyone other than in the environment. Somebody would say, that's not an appropriate way to engage with a person that's sharing about something that's that traumatic.
Are you saying that even the general public would say that, or are you saying that from the point of view of someone trained in psychology?
No, I would say the general public. I would say if you went and you read my PhD, which will take you a little while to do, but I deliberately used a lot of direct quotes from journalists. So say from Time Magazine or from the New York Post or from the New York Times or from the Washington Post or from the Huffington Post or whatever, people that had gone through on their own volition and then had written, this is basically what happened. And this is how people responded. And so I was also quite cautious to kind of go, was this maybe just some rogue trainer who was doing something? Or was this a consistent pattern that we start seeing over and over and over again? And with each claim that I make, there are multiple examples of the sorts of interactions that I'm describing. And then you can kind of look a little bit further back and you can see, well, what sorts of things were described in Est. And somebody might say, okay, well, you've taken some of that from Pressman's book. And Pressman wasn't exactly a fan of Est or Erhardt. But the book of Est, written by Luke Reinhardt, the foreword is written by Werner Erhardt. He says, this gives a great idea of what goes on in an Est seminar. I support Luke Reinhardt entirely. So I made sure that I looked at those sources. I also made sure, even from the journalists, there were journalists that thought it was great. There were journalists who thought that it was problematic. And this is for whether it's LifeSpring or Est or the Forum or whatever. I tried to make sure that I got viewpoints from different perspectives. And the difference wasn't necessarily what was being described. It was the way that it was being described. So they would say, this happened. But the person that's really enjoyed it would say, well, this was tough love and ruthless compassion, and it was a necessary thing in X, Y, and Z. Whereas the person who was more skeptical and was more like, I didn't like it, would say, this is what happened, and I thought that it was inappropriate and whatever. But they were saying the same things. And, I think that's the only fair way to try to have a look at what takes place and how people responded.
I have, that's really great. I want to kind of, because right there is, you and I wanted to talk a little bit about informed consent, which I think you're sort of broaching on a little bit of what that might look like. But before we go there, I have two questions. One, have you read or do you know about the book Speaking Being by Drew Kopp? And
you've asked me about this before. I haven't read it.
I have. Okay.
Yeah. So
I was just curious.
The one that relates to, is that Heidegger?
Yeah, it's loosely, but it was highly because I actually introduced them, and Drew came to the Being a Leader course where I sort of hosted a little bit of a mini revival of Werner, and through that, and that's launched that project. And so I was just curious. I'll be curious when and if you do read it someday, what your thoughts are. But also, I wanted to note, to my knowledge, and in all the sort of investigation that I've done, because part of what I'm doing too, a little bit like you, is like, wait, what's the lineage here? Wait, as I began to start to see some of the problems in my own life and in the lives, particularly my family, and see like, I still look back on my years with Landmark very fondly, but I've come to realize that almost all of my appreciation is about the people I met and the adventures I got to have. I got to travel the world. I got to be trained to lead programs that made a difference in people's lives. And I think I did make a difference in people's lives. I had lots of people come to me since the book came out and say, I want you to know that you made a difference for me, which has been really sweet. So I don't have regrets in that way, but I do, as I began to investigate, to my knowledge, Outrageous Betrayal is the only unauthorized, un-Werner influenced book out there about the subject until mine. I mean, mine I would say it's Werner influenced because it's, of course, my experience in working with him. So I'm obviously influenced by him, but he certainly did not authorize my book, nor I doubt he would. And, but I find that interesting. And so then the counterpoint is, Pressman was paid by Scientology, which I've been looking for evidence. I'm talking to several people that are deep inside of Scientology. So far, there is no evidence that Scientology paid him. Now, there is likelihood that Scientology, who does have a lot of investigative, we've all heard the stories, right? They have private eyes and stuff like that, who were investigating. So for sure, I believe some of the information that Pressman was given came from that, although most of his citation is from legal cases. And, but my thing is always, well, so what? The information is still the information. I mean, that the private eye found something does not negate that something. And that's a kind of logic system that's around these graduate bodies a lot, like the messenger's the problem. And, which conveniently lets us sort of not have to deal with the message. And I sort of have
Well,
some compassion for that,
yeah,
because I lived in that space for a long time myself. I researched Werner, and I literally never found outrageous betrayal until it was actually a journalist that handed it to me. And I used to
yeah,
search books on Werner Erhard and didn't find it.
yeah. I mean, I
So
think that you're
any
making a
thoughts?
very good. I think you're making a very good point about a couple of things. I mean, it's easy to say about any topic. This person's got an axe to grind, therefore I'm not going to believe anything that they say. And if you are not wanting to look at information that challenges what you would like to believe, then it's a very easy thing to do. I don't doubt that Scientology did not like Erhard, so they were competing for similar people in a similar space. So I imagine Hubbard wasn't happy about the situation. But I think that any information that's provided needs to be looked at on its own merits. Two things can be true at the same time. Scientology
Right.
could not like Erhard and would like to see him fail, and there may have been, you know, some things that were done that were not great by Erhard. So you'd have to look at that information independently if you would like to. And I think it's really an important thing to note that for a lot of people they don't want to do that, and
Yeah.
we can speak about
They
the
don't have to,
psychology.
right?
We can speak about the psychology of that, but you know, you've asked me before at some point, you know, why would people stay with an organization if they weren't enjoying it, or if they felt that they weren't being treated well? And I think there have been quite a couple of comments about that as well. You can look at it through the lens of something called social identity theory, and this is really just the idea that parts of who we are come from the groups that we belong to, and it might be I'm a man, or I am American, or I am, a particular sportsman, or whatever. I'm a Christian, or I'm a Muslim, or whatever. And each of these groups that we belong to provide us with part of our identity. And depending on how much we identify with those groups, it might provide a bigger sense of who we are. And so what sorts of, and what you find, and I mean, the psychologist that looked at this was a guy named Henry Tajfel, and they did studies where, you know, you can divide people into groups completely arbitrarily based on nothing. Within a very short period of time, they've worked out reasons why the group that they're in is better than the other group, because we naturally want to form an association with a group and kind of say we are good and they are bad. And it's not a conscious thing, but in order to survive throughout history, we've had to identify with particular groups. But when we're part of groups, we want those groups to have good characteristics because we take on the characteristics of the group. Earlier on, you said, you know, we were changing the world. I mean, could there be anything better in terms of I'm a good person and we want to be good people, and I'm doing something that's adding value to the world. And anyone that now challenges that organization is taking away. It's not the organization that's being challenged, although it is. It's the individual, because suddenly that part of the identity is being threatened. And we can see that on on even much smaller levels. We just had the Olympics. You guys must have felt pretty good. You guys won quite a lot of gold medals. How many races did you run in? How many pole vaults and high jumps and swimming races? None of you guys did any of it, but you felt really good. That's social identity. The group that you belong to has done well. You feel good. If your sports team does well, you feel good. If they do badly, you feel something bad. And the level of connection that you have with being an American, I don't know. I know patriotism is big in America, but I doubt it's
Embarrassed
at the same
American,
level
that's my status.
Yeah.
I doubt it's at the same level as being part of an organization like Landmark. There was a huge part of who you were, you know, the all of the good that you believed about the organization was good that you believed about yourself. So questioning it isn't questioning the organization. It's questioning who you are, even though those two things should be separated. And I think that that's a big thing that people maybe aren't completely aware of.
Is that what's meant by, I'm curious, a big term here in the United States right now is, at the risk of bringing up politics, but identity politics, right? Like, it's like I identify with that group or that party. And so sort of irrespective of the facts, honestly, or even happenings that we see with our own eyes, we'll pull for that identity over what's there. Is that part of that as well?
Absolutely. And so if you identify with a particular group, you're likely to identify with the norms of that group and the beliefs of that group, even if some of them don't necessarily like align with each other. And again, I'm not going to get into American politics. This is not something that I know a lot about.
Right.
But let's
stay away from that third rail.
Let's just talk very briefly about, if you think about some of the things that that Democrats like believe in, or some of the things that Republicans tend to be in, and obviously this is generalizing, some of them have got nothing to do with each other, if you know what I mean. So why would a strong belief in this have anything to do with this? They're completely unrelated, but they go together as a package, because it's very difficult to kind of be like, well, I agree with that, and that, but I'm totally against you on that. Because as soon as you say I'm totally against you on that, suddenly you are siding with the enemy or the out group, and then that makes it very difficult for you to fit in with the particular in group. And it's so I don't
That's
know.
really interesting.
The key part of it is that not only do we have in groups, not only do we identify with each other and go, oh yeah, I really have simpatico with you on that, but what's almost as important in that is that there is always an out group. There's someone else out there that stands in contrast. There's a really fascinating podcast by Dr. David Eagleman on his Inner Cosmos podcast, where he talks about just the neuro side of what in and out groups have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, people even identify with the out group, right?
We've got a desire to feel good about ourselves. I mean, that's a fairly self-evident thing. We want to feel good about ourselves. And so what can we do to do that? And this doesn't mean that you're doing it consciously, but either you elevate the in-group, so you think about all the good things about the in-group, or to be relatively good compared to the out-group, you denigrate the out-group. You think of reasons why they are less than you. And I mean, so this is a theory that's really helpful in understanding, racism and sexism and homophobia and stigma with mental illness, because in-group good, out-group bad, that's the very simple thing that's going on. And so when you're aware of it, you can kind of circumnavigate that automatic thinking and kind of go, okay, I naturally do this. What can I do to maybe be more aware and not do it so automatically? Yeah.
I have a brilliant question for the next subject we wanted to get into, which we'll do for those of you listening in our next episode. We are going to talk with Dr. John about informed consent and how that relates to what we've been talking about.
We want to thank you so much, Dr. John, for being with us today. And for those of you who are listening, really listen for part 2, which for you will be in a little bit, and for us will be immediately. That's the magic of podcasting. And so we want to thank you, John. Do you want to share your socials or how people can look at your website or anything like that?
Yeah. So I mean, I've got a website. So there's still a couple of podcasts that I need to upload, but it's johnhunterphd.com.
And we'll, of course, put that in the show notes so people can find you.
Yeah, you can find my PhDs there. There's a much shorter article on LGATs. It's about 1,000 words that will give you a nice overview. There are a bunch of podcasts.
It's tidy. I read it last night. It's really great.
Yeah. And you can contact me if you'd like to ask me a question, or if you're unhappy with something that I've said, I'd be happy to engage if I've got the capacity. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. And so stay tuned for part 2. This has been Confronting the Line. I'm Mark Tafoya with Ann L. Peterson, and we'll see you next time.